Well, hello, my friends, and welcome back to Embrace the Question. It's good to see you, and it's our midweek Bible study with me. I hope you're ready to take another look at this life recorded in Genesis of Jacob. Our story with Jacob is in some ways winding up. We are starting to shift to the story of his kids. Again, we've already had a bit of exposure to these guys, and we've made the observation they're really not all that nice. So I don't think that it's their moral character that is making them famous here. It's certainly not why we would think that God had chosen them to propagate the lineage of the Messiah. But we're seeing God's redemptive hand at work everywhere in this story. Started out early with Abraham. Abraham had his issues. He had his weaknesses with fear and lying. And Isaac had the same. A lot of what Isaac went through mimicked what his father went through. And now we're seeing it again with Jacob, who is labeled the deceiver. And he continues to deceive and be deceived. It seems like whenever you embrace something, or whenever something is prominent in your life, that kind of makes you a target for that very same thing in some ways. We know that he deceived his brother. We know that his mother deceived his father, Isaac, her husband. So this is something that runs in the family. And we're going to see more and more of it as we go. And it's an amazing thing that God can work with such things, is it not? It should give us all a lot of comfort, because I doubt seriously that you guys deal with these hang-ups to the extent that Jacob did. It should give us all comfort. None of us are perfect, but my goodness, this guy really made a long run of deception and being deceived, and still making himself in the position of being blessed by God. And we're going to talk about that. So let's get started with Genesis 35. Okay, Genesis 35. Again, I'm in eSword. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It's one of my favorite ones. I also like the LitV, the literal version. And I reference the King James and the King James Plus because I can easily cross-reference Hebrew names there. So let's start here. Verse 1. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. That's what the screen is showing here, this 4-verse segment. So let's start with this. I was first caught up by the dialogue in the first verse where God talks about himself in the third person, right? Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God. He's talking about himself, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. Okay, our last part of the story where Bethel is involved is back in chapter 32. Okay, so we'll get back to that because it'll be referenced down below here. So Jacob says, all right, put away your foreign gods. You know, I think that a lot of times we as Christians, we're brought up, many of us are brought up as Christians. Our parents were Christians, grandparents, great-grandparents, Christians. Maybe not all to the same degree, right? They might have all been churchgoers or simply just lived moral lives and ascribed to the teachings of Jesus. We call ourselves Christians. And we think often that these guys in the Old Testament were the early Christians. It's just something, I think it's a mental block that at least I have. Maybe you never went there. For me, I've always considered these the early Christians, and they're not. They are not early Christians. They're not even, they're just barely followers of God at this point. Abraham was likely polytheistic, worshiped many gods. His father was. And now we see in Jacob's house, put away all your gods. Well, my goodness, man, you're a third generation from Abraham, the man, the father of our faith, and you've got a house full of gods. How is that? I believe that to them, remember, the law had not been given. The you shall not have any other gods before me command is still years from being given on Mount Sinai. So these guys are very young, and God just he doesn't march in and lay out the law to these guys. He doesn't say, hey, Jacob, I'm God, your father. I am the only God. I am the real God. And now I need you to burn everything that you thought was God. He never does that. And he doesn't do it in our lives either. Because face it, this idea of idolatry, we may not get down on our knees and worship gods of rock and wood, but we worship other things instead. The gods of sports, the gods of, family, even the gods of religion, the gods of church sometimes. Anything that we have to ask permission of before we do God's will is a god in our life. Could be the god of the bass boat. Could be the god of the bass boat. Those very things that we ask God for as blessings, sometimes those we set up before him and make those prominent in our lives. Sad but true. So Jacob still has a house full of gods, but he's starting to get it. He's starting to go with this idea that none of these have talked to me. None of these have ever spoken into my life. None of these have ever blessed me. I know they're in my house. Maybe it's time to grow up a little bit. Let's bury these. So they do. They hide them under the terebinth tree. Now, I read that. That's verse 4. And I'm thinking, is this the same tree that Abraham planted? And I went back and researched that, and alas, no, it is not. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree. Now, that would have been an interesting study indeed, but it apparently is a different tree. All right, there we go. Let's go on to verse 5. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Now remember, why would they pursue the sons of Jacob? Well, we ended the last chapter with Shechem raping their daughter Dinah, wanting to take her to be his wife. Now, Shechem was a prince of the locals. He was one of the high-ups, a royalty. And the brothers deceived Shechem and all of the men of the city, got them to get circumcised, and while they're recovering from that, they come in and they murder everybody. So that might leave a bad taste in the mouth of all those in the countryside. They would have a reason to pursue Jacob. But in this case, a terror from God falls upon them, and they do not pursue. So verse 6, Jacob comes to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him. when he fled his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Elon Bekuth. Elon is oak, Bekuth is weeping. So the oak of weeping, or Bekith. Okay, verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. Let's stop. That's verse 10. Hadn't this already happened? This happened whenever Jacob wrestled with God back 3 chapters earlier. Chapter 32, verse 28. Jacob wrestles with God. He prevails, says, "I won't let you go until you bless me." And so God blesses him, calls his name Israel. Your name shall no longer be Jacob. Well, again, this happens. Verse 10, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel will be your name. So he called his name Israel. And I want to come back to this question at the end. Israel means Jacob has overcome. And I want to ask the question, what has Jacob overcome? We'll come back. Verse 11, and God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." Okay, I pay attention to stuff like this because what it means to me is that ultimately God always owns the land. He always owns the land. He gave it to Abraham, yes? He gave it to Abraham, but Abraham's gone. So who does it revert back to? It reverts to God. God is the ultimate owner. So he gives it to Isaac, and Isaac, he's almost done with it here, as we're about to see. So now God is giving it to Jacob. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. This was all determined. I think this is just a recap, really, more than anything. Okay, 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel, where they were still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel went into labor, and she had a hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, "Don't fear, for you have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. I want to stop right there. So remember when they were departing from Laban, they were a day's ride away from Laban. Laban pursues them and catches them and says, "Why are you trying to escape? Why are you fleeing me like I'm some villain? And why did you take my gods?" And Jacob's, "What? We don't have your gods." Anybody who is caught with your gods is going to die. Because Jacob didn't know that Rachel had taken the gods. So unbeknownst to anyone else, especially, except Rachel, especially Jacob, didn't know that his beloved wife Rachel had taken the gods of Laban. There's so much to talk about there. One, Rachel is, why did she take the gods? Why is she so into these foreign gods? Was she just trying to hurt Laban? Did she have an affinity for these foreign gods herself? Don't know. But now Jacob has pronounced a curse on her, basically. You're going to die because you are the ones that took the gods. Well, it probably took a few years, but the fruit of his lips is coming to manifest in this event. So I am also reminded Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, because you don't have the ability to back anything up. So stop swearing by God or by heaven or even by yourself, because you can't even control yourself. Stop swearing. But that's what Jacob did, and it's costing him, and it's costing her. The son, Ben-Oni, son of mourning. Benjamin, the son of mourning. Now, Benjamin's going to be a very special son to Jacob because Rachel was his beloved. He loved Rachel more than anyone else on earth. And she bears him Benjamin and Joseph. Okay, now Benjamin, she tries to name him Ben-Oni, son of mourning, of sorrow, because she knows that she's dying and she's sorrowful. Jacob says, no, his name will be Benjamin, son of my right hand, my right arm. If you didn't catch that, both of these apply to Messiah. These are messianic terms. These are both pictures in a way of Jesus himself. Jesus is our suffering servant, our man of sorrow. But he's also the one who overcame and ascended to the right hand of God. So we have both incorporated into the picture of Messiah here. An amazing thing. All right, let's keep going. In verse 20, and Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It's the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. And while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel heard of it. Now, the sons of Jacob were 12, and it's going to start listing these guys. But I want you to note that according to verse 22, that's the end of that story. That's the end of that matter. That Reuben, his oldest, goes in and lays with his father's concubine, Bilhah. Okay, this is eerily familiar. And I'm going to get to that too here in just a minute. Let's finish this out and talk about the sons here of Jacob in verse 23. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. All right, two things here. What had Jacob overcome in his life that God so wanted to bless him, that God chose him, that God decided this is the guy that I can trust to take my lineage to that next level? What is it about Jacob? Because, again, he was a deceiver to the end. Really? Well, if we take an honest look at Jacob's life, we can tell that there are differences between him and his relatives. Jacob always categorized what he had as being given to him by God himself. Unlike Laban, who said, these sheep, these cattle, these daughters, they're all mine. This is my stuff. Jacob, on the other hand, thought of things differently. God has given me all of this. God has blessed me. God has given me my two wives. that I worked for 14 years. This is the way Jacob viewed things. Jacob listened to God. When God said to do something, Jacob moved. We saw it even illustrated in this chapter. He listened to God, but he also interpreted his whole life by God. Everything that he had, he attributed to God. Jacob sought the blessing of God. Do you seek God's blessing? I mean, do you seek it? Do you wrestle him for it? That's a message all in itself. But that's an interesting, commendable thing. God, you are the one who can bless me. You are the God of gods. So I'm going to contend with you for blessing because you are able. You see, that's kind of counterintuitive to what maybe we think of in the West here, especially as encroachment upon God's territory, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob saw it as something that could be seized because God is good. That's a fascinating thing to me. All right. Secondly, let's talk about the end of this story, these similarities that we see in this story with, say, the story of David. In verse 22, Israel lived in the land, and while he was away, Reuben goes and lays with Bilhah, his father's concubine. This happened to David. The similarities are pretty fascinating because David has 4 sons. David's 4 sons are Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, and Solomon. We have Amnon going into his sister Tamar, raping her, and much like what we're seeing with the previous chapter, Shechem, who is not a brother, but Shechem goes in and rapes Dinah. Okay, so juxtapose those two events. Then we have the fallout, which is Jacob's sons get angry and go and kill everybody in the camp of Shechem. While in David's generation, we have the angry brothers go in and violently kill Amnon, the revenge of the brothers. Okay, in both cases, Jacob sees what's going on and does nothing. In the same way, David sees what's going on and does nothing. In this story, we see Reuben go in and lying with his father's concubine Bilhah. While in the story of David, we have Absalom, who goes in while David is basically fleeing, and he lies with all of his father's concubines on the roof of the palace. You may remember that story. The two people are similar too. Jacob, I think, what did he overcome? Well, he overcame his view. He never overcame his sin. He never overcame his sin. He didn't have the ability to overcome his sin. David did not have the ability to overcome his sin either, any more than you and I did. It took a Messiah. It took someone who died on the cross to overcome our sin for us. What we can do is change our view about our sin. Jacob did not blame others for his misfortunes. He blamed himself. Jacob also gave God credit for everything he had, just like David. David was a man after God's own heart because of his attitude towards his own sin. When David fell with adultery to Bathsheba and the murder of her husband, he got on his face before God and realized, I am nothing compared to God. I have brought this on myself. God is good. Whatever he says can go for me and my life. I find that really provoking that we seem to have a mirror image going here. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward and see if that continues to rear its head. Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed this version, this episode of Bible Study with me. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm learning a lot. I am learning a lot. They often say, if you don't know it, teach it. Well, that describes me in my life because I didn't know anything until I started to teach things. And it just helps me to remember. So if you have comments, questions, anything like that, anything I missed, anything I misspoke, please let me know in the comments. I do appreciate every comment I get, and I like to see your names pop up. Just at least say hi, because I worry about you sometimes if I don't see you for a while. I want to know you're there. So, okay? Love you guys, and I'll see you on the next go around. Peace out.